The moment your spouse starts treating your presence like an optional appointment instead of a valued part of their life, something important has already broken, even if nobody wants to admit it yet. I did not understand that truth on the day it happened. I understood it 3 seconds later, after Claire looked up from her phone and calmly told me that from now on she would decide when we talked, when we spent time together, and that I needed to stop chasing her. The words were not loud. That was what made them so powerful. There was no argument, no warning, no dramatic build-up, just a quiet Thursday evening in October and a sentence that landed like a crack running through a foundation. My name is Ryan Mitchell. I was 48 years old at the time. I lived in a comfortable suburb outside Indianapolis, Indiana, the kind of neighborhood where people waved while walking their dogs and spent Saturday mornings trimming hedges and washing pickup trucks in their driveways. From the outside, my life looked stable. Good job. Nice house. Long marriage. The kind of life people spend years trying to build. Yet there I stood in my own living room holding 2 mugs of coffee while my wife explained that my attention had become something she no longer wanted. The lamp beside the couch cast a warm glow across the room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Pictures from vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, moments that suggested a happy history. Claire sat curled into one corner of the sofa scrolling through her phone while I stood near the coffee table trying to decide whether I had heard her correctly. "You need to stop chasing me," she said again without looking up. Looking back, that was the detail I remember most. She never even looked at me. I set the coffee mugs down carefully. One for her, one for me. Steam drifted upward between us. For a moment, I wanted to ask questions. What exactly did she mean? How long had she felt this way? Why was she telling me now? But something inside me stopped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was the realization that none of those questions would change what had just happened. Claire finally glanced up. Her expression was calm, almost relieved, as if she had been carrying that statement around for a while and was happy to put it down. "I just need space," she said. "I feel like you are always trying to make plans or have conversations." I nodded slowly. The strange thing was that I knew exactly what she meant. I was always making plans, always starting conversations, always trying to keep us connected. Dinner reservations, weekend trips, movie nights, walks through the neighborhood. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things married couples used to do naturally. Somewhere along the way, I had become the only one organizing them. What I did not realize at the time was how much that fact mattered. The room fell silent. The furnace kicked on somewhere in the house. Outside, a light rain tapped softly against the windows. Claire returned her attention to her phone. The conversation was over as far as she was concerned. But for me, something had just begun. I sat in the armchair across from her and watched the reflection of the lamp flicker against the dark television screen. For years, every time I felt distance growing between us, my response had been simple. Try harder. Call more. Ask more questions. Be more patient. Make more effort. If one bridge started collapsing, I built another. Then another. Then another. I had spent so long believing that persistence could solve everything that I never stopped to ask whether I was the only one carrying the tools. And then a thought entered my mind so clearly it almost startled me. If Claire truly wanted me to stop chasing her, what would happen if I actually listened? Not for a day, not for a week. Completely. The answer frightened me because I honestly did not know. For 18 years my role had been predictable, reliable, available. I was always there, always reaching, always trying. But sitting in that quiet living room with rain sliding down the windows and untouched coffee cooling on the table, I made a decision that would change everything. For the first time since I met Claire Mitchell, I was going to stop running towards someone who kept stepping away. The strange thing about building your entire identity around being needed is that you do not realize how much of yourself has disappeared until the need suddenly vanishes. The morning after that conversation, I woke up before sunrise like I always did. The house was quiet. A thin layer of fog hung over the neighborhood outside the kitchen window. I stood at the counter making coffee while the familiar routine unfolded around me. Normally, somewhere between my first and second cup, I would send Claire a text. Nothing dramatic, just something simple. Hope your meeting goes well. Drive safe. Let me know if you want to grab dinner tonight. Small messages, small efforts, small reminders that someone was thinking about her. That morning, I picked up my phone, stared at the screen for a few seconds, and then set it back down. Looking back, That moment mattered more than I realized. It was the first time in years that I chose not to fill the silence. The day moved forward. Meetings, emails, deadlines, ordinary things. Yet every now and then I found myself reaching for my phone out of habit. Every time I stopped. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to make a point, because for the first time, I was curious. Curious about what would happen if I stopped carrying the entire weight of staying connected. What I did not realize was how much of my life had been organized around maintaining a relationship that seemed to require constant effort from only one side. During lunch, I sat alone in my truck outside the office and found myself thinking about the early years of our marriage. Claire and I had not started with much. Our first apartment had outdated appliances and a parking lot that flooded every spring. We used folding chairs as dining room furniture for almost 6 months because we could not afford anything better. Yet I remember those years fondly. We laughed more, talked more, dreamed more. Somewhere along the way, responsibility replaced adventure. Then routine replaced connection. Then effort became one-sided. At least now I could finally see it. That evening, I arrived home just before 6. The smell of rain drifted through the open garage as I stepped inside. Claire was already there. She sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone while a television played quietly in the family room. Normally, I would have walked over and started a conversation. Asked about her day, asked about work, asked whether she wanted to order takeout or go somewhere for dinner. Instead, I simply nodded and headed upstairs to change clothes. The interaction lasted less than 5 seconds. I noticed her glance up as I walked away. It was brief, but it happened. Later that night, while I sat in the den reviewing some work reports, I kept waiting for guilt to arrive. I expected to feel selfish, neglectful, wrong somehow. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I wanted distance, because I was no longer exhausting myself trying to eliminate it. That realization stayed with me throughout the week. The more I stepped back, the more clearly I could see how much energy I had been spending on things that produced almost nothing in return. By Friday afternoon, another uncomfortable truth had emerged. For years, I had measured the health of our marriage by the amount of effort I was willing to invest. If things felt distant, I worked harder. If communication weakened, I reached further. If connection faded, I pushed more. But what if effort was never supposed to flow in only one direction? What if I had mistaken persistence for partnership? That night, as rain tapped softly against the windows and the glow of streetlights reflected across wet pavement outside, I sat alone in the living room where everything had started. The same couch, the same lamp, the same family photographs. Yet the room felt different now. Not because Claire had changed, because I had. And as I stared at the untouched second coffee mug sitting in the cabinet where it always belonged, I realized something that both frightened and liberated me at the same time. For the first time in 18 years, I was no longer trying to pull someone closer. I was simply standing still and waiting to see whether they would take a single step toward me. Looking back, the most dangerous problems in a marriage were never the obvious ones. They were the small disappointments that happened so often you eventually stopped reacting to them. Once I stopped spending all my energy trying to close the distance between Claire and me, I began seeing things with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. The patterns had always been there. I had simply been too busy compensating for them to notice. A few days after my decision to step back, I found myself replaying moments from the past several years. Not major events, small ones. The kind people rarely talk about because they seem insignificant on their own. Yet when enough of them accumulate, they start telling a story. One Friday night stood out immediately. About a year earlier, I had made reservations at a restaurant downtown that Claire had mentioned wanting to try. Nothing extravagant, just a nice place overlooking the canal. I remembered leaving work early, getting home ahead of schedule, and putting on a clean button-down shirt. 30 minutes before we were supposed to leave, Claire walked into the kitchen holding her phone. "I completely forgot," she said. "Melissa invited me to something tonight." That was it. No discussion, no attempt to reschedule, no sign that canceling mattered. I remember standing there with my car keys in my hand while she grabbed her purse and headed out the door. At the time, I told myself it was not a big deal. Looking back, I realized I had repeated that sentence hundreds of times. Another memory surfaced. A Saturday afternoon in early spring. The weather had been perfect. 70 degrees. Clear skies. I suggested we drive out to a state park about 40 miles away and spend the afternoon walking the trails. Claire barely looked up from her phone. Maybe another time, she said. That other time never came. Months later, I learned she had spent that same afternoon at a social event with friends. Again, I convinced myself it was not worth mentioning. But I was beginning to understand something important. Every ignored invitation carried a message, even when nobody said it out loud. Then there were the conversations. Or more accurately, the attempts at conversations. So many evenings followed the same script that I could practically predict them. I would ask about her day. She would answer with a sentence or two. I would ask a follow-up question. She would glance at her phone before responding. Within minutes, the conversation would disappear entirely. Yet if someone else called, she could talk for an hour without checking the time. That realization stung more than I wanted to admit. What happened next surprised me. The more memories surfaced, the less angry I became. Instead, I felt disappointed. Not only in Claire, in myself. Because I could finally see how often I had accepted behavior that hurt me while pretending it did not. I had become an expert at explaining things away. She is stressed. She is tired. Work has been busy. She does not mean anything by it. Every excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a wall between reality and accountability. One evening, about 2 weeks after everything changed, I came home and found Claire sitting at the kitchen island. Normally, I would have started a conversation immediately. Instead, I grabbed a bottle of water and headed toward the den. "How was your day?" she asked suddenly. I stopped walking. The question itself was ordinary. What made it unusual was that she had initiated it. For a second, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I could not remember the last time that had happened. "It was good," I replied. She nodded and looked back at her phone. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet it stayed with me all evening. Not because it fixed anything, because it revealed something. The moment I stopped chasing every interaction, she finally took a small step forward. It was not much. Barely noticeable, really. But it was enough to make me realize that the story I had been telling myself for years might not be true. Maybe the problem was never that Claire needed more effort from me. Maybe the problem was that she had grown so accustomed to receiving it that she no longer recognized its value. And for the first time, I found myself wondering what would happen if that realization continued to grow. The experiment continued, although I never thought of it that way at the time. To me, it simply felt like stepping out of a role I had been playing for so long that I no longer remembered who I was without it. The days moved forward. October gave way to November. The trees around our neighborhood shifted from bright orange to bare branches, and the air carried the sharp chill that always arrived before winter settled into Indiana. What surprised me most was how little effort it took to stop chasing once I made the decision. For years, I had convinced myself that maintaining our connection required constant attention. Yet the moment I stepped back, I realized most of that effort had become habit rather than necessity. One Saturday morning, I woke up before Claire and drove to a local trail about 20 miles outside the city. The sky was clear. Frost covered the grass. A thin layer of mist hovered above a small lake near the entrance. I had not gone hiking alone in years. Standing there with a travel mug of coffee in one hand and a backpack slung over my shoulder, I felt strangely nervous. It was the kind of nervousness that comes when you revisit a part of yourself that has been neglected for a long time. The trail wound through a forest of tall oak trees. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my boots. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became. No notifications, no schedules, no attempts to manage someone else's feelings. Just the sound of wind moving through branches and the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. Looking back, that morning mattered more than I realized. It was the first time in years that I spent several hours without thinking about how to improve my marriage. When I returned home that afternoon, Claire was sitting on the patio wrapped in a light jacket, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I approached. "Where have you been?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unusual, because it had been a long time since she had shown any curiosity about my day. "Out hiking," I replied. She lowered her phone slightly. "Since when do you hike?" I almost smiled. "I used to all the time." For a second, she looked genuinely surprised. Then she nodded and returned to her screen. The conversation lasted maybe 15 seconds. Yet I thought about it for the rest of the day. Claire did not know I used to hike. Or maybe she had forgotten. Either possibility revealed something uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, parts of me had become invisible. What happened next surprised me even more. The following week, I met an old friend named Jason for lunch. We had worked together years earlier before he moved into a different company. Like many friendships in middle age, ours had slowly faded beneath careers, responsibilities, and family obligations. We spent nearly 2 hours talking. Work, sports, aging parents, retirement plans, ordinary things. Yet when I drove back to the office, I felt lighter than I had in months. That evening, Claire asked another unexpected question. How was your lunch? I looked up from the kitchen counter. Good. She hesitated. Who did you meet? There was that curiosity again. Small, subtle, but present. Jason. She nodded slowly. I did not know you still talked to him. Neither did I thought. Not because I had stopped valuing the friendship, because I had stopped making room for it. As the weeks passed, similar moments continued appearing. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation. No sudden shift. Just little signs that something was changing. Claire would ask where I was going. She would ask what I was doing. She would ask how my day went. The questions were simple, yet they stood out because they had become so rare. At the same time, I noticed another change. The more I invested in my own life, the less anxious I felt about hers. For years, her attention had felt like a resource I needed to secure. Now it felt like something that should either exist naturally or not at all. One evening, while sitting alone in the den watching rain streak across the windows, I finally understood what was happening. I was not trying to make Claire notice me anymore. I was simply becoming someone I had neglected for far too long. And for the first time since that conversation in the living room, I had a feeling that the silence between us was beginning to tell a different story than either of us expected. By the time December arrived, I had stopped counting the days since that conversation in the living room. Not because it no longer mattered, because something else had started mattering more. For the first time in years, my attention was no longer focused entirely on what Claire was doing, feeling, or thinking. It had slowly returned to my own life. The change was not dramatic. Most people probably would not have noticed it. Yet I felt it every morning. I felt it when I woke up without immediately wondering what mood Claire might be in. I felt it when I made plans without checking whether she approved of them first. I felt it when entire afternoons passed without me analyzing the state of our marriage. Looking back, I think that was the moment my life began expanding again. One Saturday morning, I joined Jason and a few of his friends for a hike about 45 minutes outside Indianapolis. The sky was bright blue, a light dusting of snow-covered sections of the trail. The cold air stung my face as we climbed a ridge overlooking a frozen lake. For nearly 3 hours, we talked about everything except relationships, careers, sports, retirement goals, travel plans, ordinary conversations between ordinary people. Yet as simple as it sounds, the experience felt almost unfamiliar. For so long, my world had become smaller without me realizing it. Now it was growing again. What happened next surprised me. When I returned home that afternoon, Claire was in the kitchen preparing coffee. She looked up immediately when I walked through the door. How was it? She asked. The question seemed simple, but I noticed something different in her tone. Genuine interest. Not politeness. Interest. It was great, I said. Cold, but worth it. She nodded. Did you have fun? For a second, I just looked at her. I could not remember the last time she had asked me that question. Did you have fun? It was such a small thing. Yet somehow it carried more weight than entire conversations we had shared over the previous year. Yeah, I replied. I did. Claire smiled faintly before looking back down at her mug. The moment passed quickly. Still, it stayed with me. During the following weeks, similar moments kept appearing. One evening, I was researching hiking routes on my laptop when Claire walked into the den. She stood behind me for a few seconds. Planning another trip? She asked. Maybe. Where? Brown County. She pulled up a chair and looked at the map on my screen. That alone felt unusual. For years, my interests had barely registered on her radar. Now she seemed curious. Not consistently, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Around the same time, another shift was happening inside me. The more independent I became emotionally, the more clearly I could see the dynamic that had existed between us. For years, Claire had occupied the center of my emotional universe. Every decision, every plan, every effort, everything revolved around preserving our connection. Without realizing it, I had taught myself that my value depended on how much I could give. The problem was that people eventually stopped noticing what is always available. That realization was difficult to accept, but it explained far more than I wanted it to. One Friday evening, we attended a neighborhood holiday event. The house was filled with Christmas lights, laughter, and the smell of cinnamon desserts. At one point, I found myself talking with several people about hiking trails and travel plans for the upcoming spring. The conversation flowed naturally. I laughed more that night than I had in months. Then I happened to glance across the room. Claire was watching. Not angrily, not suspiciously, thoughtfully, almost as if she were seeing something she had forgotten existed. Later, while driving home through quiet streets lined with holiday decorations, she stared out the passenger window for several minutes before speaking. "You seem happier lately." The comment caught me off guard. I kept my eyes on the road. "Maybe I am." She turned slightly toward me. "Why?" The answer arrived before I could stop it. "Because I finally remembered that I have a life too." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, and as snowflakes drifted through the glow of streetlights outside, I had the distinct feeling that Claire was beginning to understand something I had only recently discovered myself. The more I stopped trying to become the center of her world, the more she started noticing the life I had been quietly rebuilding without her. What I finally understood during those winter months was something I should have recognized years earlier. The issue was never simply distance. Distance was only the symptom. The real problem was the role each of us had quietly accepted without ever discussing it. One evening in late December, I was sitting alone at a coffee shop near downtown Indianapolis after work. Outside, the sky had already turned dark even though it was barely 6 o'clock. Holiday lights reflected off wet sidewalks while people hurried past carrying shopping bags and travel mugs. I sat near the window watching strangers come and go when a thought suddenly crossed my mind. For years, I had assumed Claire wanted less attention because she valued independence. But the more I stepped back, the more curious she became. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Whenever I stopped initiating contact, she noticed. Whenever I made plans without consulting her first, she asked questions. Whenever I focused on my own interests, she paid attention. Looking back, the realization felt obvious. Yet for years I had missed it completely. What happened next surprised me even more. Instead of feeling angry, I became fascinated. I started paying closer attention to our daily interactions. Not in a suspicious way, more like an observer watching a system reveal how it actually worked. One evening I came home from work and headed straight to the den to finish a report. About 20 minutes later, Claire appeared in the doorway. "You got home earlier than usual," she said. I looked up from my laptop. Traffic was light. She nodded but remained standing there. A few seconds passed. Then she asked another question. "How was your day?" The exchange itself was ordinary. Yet what interested me was the timing. For years, I had been the one initiating nearly every conversation. Now, without realizing it, Claire had started filling some of the silence herself. That night I thought about it for hours. The more I reflected on our marriage, the clearer the pattern became. Claire had grown accustomed to something that always seemed available. My attention, my effort, my availability, my emotional energy. None of it required planning because it was always there, like electricity flowing through a wall. You rarely think about it until the lights go out. A few days later, another moment reinforced the idea. I was preparing breakfast on a Saturday morning when Claire walked into the kitchen. Snow covered the backyard. The coffee maker hummed quietly on the counter. She poured herself a cup and sat down across from me. "You have been spending a lot more time with friends lately," she said. Her tone was casual. I nodded. "A little." She stirred her coffee. "It seems like you have a lot going on." There was something beneath the comment that I could not quite identify. Curiosity, uncertainty, maybe both. "I guess I do," I replied. She stared into her cup for a moment. "You never used to." That statement stayed with me long after the conversation ended. You never used to. She was right. I never used to. For years, I had built my schedule around preserving a connection that seemed to require constant maintenance. The moment I stopped doing that, entire parts of my life began reappearing. Friends, interests, goals, experiences, things I had slowly abandoned without even noticing. What I did not realize at the time was that Claire was experiencing her own version of that discovery. She was beginning to see the difference between a husband who existed as a permanent source of attention and a husband who had his own fully developed life. One evening after dinner, I walked into the living room and found Claire looking through an old photo album. Pictures from vacations, weekend trips, family gatherings, moments from years earlier when we both looked younger and somehow more connected. She glanced up when I entered. "Do you remember this trip?" she asked, pointing at a photograph from a mountain cabin vacation nearly a decade earlier. I smiled. "Of course." She studied the picture for a few seconds longer. "We used to do things like that all the time." Her voice sounded distant. Thoughtful. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she quietly closed the album. As I watched her walk toward the kitchen, I had the unmistakable feeling that something was changing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily. Claire was starting to realize that she had not simply lost a man who chased her attention. She was beginning to miss a man whose presence she had stopped appreciating while it was always guaranteed. By the middle of January, the shift was no longer something only I could see. Other people were starting to notice it too. The strange thing was that nobody could have pointed to a specific event. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no major announcement, no life-changing decision that everyone talked about. Yet something about the way I carried myself had changed, and the people around us seemed to sense it. The clearest example came during a neighborhood gathering hosted by one of our friends on a Saturday evening. It was the kind of event that happened every winter. Good food, football playing quietly on a television in the background, groups of neighbors standing around talking about work, travel plans, and the unusually cold weather. For years, I had attended those gatherings almost on autopilot. I would spend most of the evening making small talk, while Claire naturally became the center of attention. That night felt different from the moment we arrived. A few people immediately asked about the hiking trips I had been taking. Someone wanted recommendations for trails. Someone else asked about a photography hobby I had recently picked up. Before long, I found myself engaged in several conversations at once. The odd part was not that people were talking to me. The odd part was that I was genuinely enjoying myself. Looking back, I realized how long it had been since I participated in social situations without constantly monitoring Claire's mood or wondering whether she wanted to leave early. For once, my attention remained exactly where it was, in the present moment. About halfway through the evening, I glanced across the room and noticed Claire watching me. She stood near the kitchen island speaking with two friends, yet her eyes kept drifting in my direction. The expression on her face was difficult to read. It was not anger. It was not jealousy. If anything, it looked like uncertainty, as though she was trying to understand something that no longer fit the image she had carried in her mind. What happened next surprised me. One of our neighbors laughed and said, "Ryan, you are busier than anybody I know these days. Every time I see you, you are headed somewhere." The group laughed. Before I could answer, Claire spoke from across the room. "That is true. I barely know where he is half the time anymore." Everyone smiled politely. The comment sounded harmless. Maybe it was meant to be. Yet for some reason, the room became slightly quieter afterward. I think people sensed there was more behind the statement than she intended. Years ago, I would have immediately reassured her. I would have joked about being predictable. I would have gone out of my way to emphasize that she always came first. This time, I simply smiled and continued the conversation. Nothing more, nothing less. The moment passed, but something about it lingered. On the drive home, snow flurries drifted through the glow of streetlights while the heater hummed softly inside the truck. Claire remained quiet longer than usual. Finally, she turned toward me. "People seem to enjoy talking to you lately." I glanced at her briefly before returning my attention to the road. "I guess so." She looked out the window again. "You have changed." There was no accusation in her voice, only observation. The statement hung in the air for several seconds. Then I answered honestly. Maybe I just stopped waiting for permission to enjoy my own life. The silence that followed felt different from the silences we used to share. It was not cold. It was thoughtful. Back at home, Claire lingered in the kitchen while I put away my jacket. Normally, she would have headed upstairs almost immediately. Instead, she stood beside the counter, turning a coffee mug slowly between her hands. "Ryan," she said. I looked up. "Yeah." She hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something important. Then she shook her head. "Nothing." But I knew it was not nothing. Because for the first time since this entire journey began, I could see the questions forming behind her eyes. Questions about us. Questions about me. Questions she had not felt the need to ask when she believed my attention would always be waiting exactly where she left it. And as I turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs, I had the unmistakable feeling that Claire was beginning to understand something neither of us had fully recognized before. The person she thought would always be standing still had quietly started moving forward, and she was no longer certain where that path might lead. The conversation finally happened on a cold Sunday evening near the end of January. Outside, fresh snow covered the neighborhood in a layer of white that reflected the glow of streetlights. Inside, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the furnace pushing warm air through the vents. I was sitting in the den reading when I heard Claire's footsteps in the hallway. Something about the pace of those footsteps immediately caught my attention. Slow, hesitant, deliberate. A few seconds later, she appeared in the doorway. For a moment, she simply stood there. Then she asked a question I had not expected. "Do you have a minute?" Looking back, it was such a simple sentence. Yet somehow it carried more weight than entire conversations we had shared over the previous year. I closed the book and set it on the table beside me. Sure. Claire stepped into the room and sat in the chair across from mine. Neither of us spoke right away. The silence felt different this time. It was not the empty silence that had lived between us for years. It was the kind of silence that appears when two people know an important conversation is about to begin. Finally, Claire looked down at her hands. "I feel like we are drifting apart." The words hung in the air. For a moment, I simply listened. Months earlier, hearing that sentence would have filled me with relief. I would have welcomed it as proof that she finally saw what I had been trying to discuss for years. Instead, I felt calm. Not because I did not care. Because I had already spent months accepting the reality she was only beginning to notice. Claire looked up. "Do you not feel it?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "I do." She seemed encouraged by my answer. For a second, it looked as though she expected the conversation to become easier. It did not. Another silence settled over the room. Snow drifted past the windows. Somewhere upstairs, the floor creaked as the house adjusted to the cold. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary details. Yet everything felt unusually sharp. Claire folded her arms. "You barely talk to me anymore." The irony of the statement almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, because it revealed how differently we remembered the same years. I thought about all the conversations I had tried to start, all the evenings I had attempted to create connection, all the invitations that quietly disappeared. But I kept my voice steady. "I talk when there is something to talk about." Claire frowned. "That is not fair." I studied her expression for a moment before asking a question of my own. "What part is not fair?" She opened her mouth, then stopped. For the first time since entering the room, she seemed uncertain. "You have changed," she finally said. "You used to try harder." There it was. The sentence neither of us had been able to say directly. "You used to try harder." I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the dark window beside us. For years, I had measured my value by how much effort I could give. The idea felt so normal that I never questioned it. Now, hearing those words spoken out loud, I understood the problem more clearly than ever. Claire was not talking about love. She was talking about pursuit, about certainty, about knowing that no matter how distant she became, I would continue moving toward her. I took a slow breath. "Do you remember what you told me back in October?" The change in her expression was immediate. She knew exactly which conversation I meant. "Yes," she said quietly. I nodded. "You told me that you wanted to decide when we talked. When we spent time together. You told me to stop chasing you." Claire looked away. The room became very still. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered something I never expected to hear. "I did not think you actually would." The honesty of the answer caught me off guard. There was no defensiveness in her voice. No attempt to justify anything. Just honesty. I looked at her carefully. For the first time in months, I could see genuine regret behind her eyes. Not regret because I had become angry. Not regret because I had punished her. Regret because she was finally experiencing the distance she once believed she wanted. And as the silence settled around us once again, I realized this conversation was no longer about blame. It was about consequences. Because sometimes the hardest lesson in any relationship is discovering that the things we take for granted do not disappear all at once. They disappear one unnoticed moment at a time until one day we look up and realize how much we missed them. The weeks after that conversation did not transform our marriage overnight. There was no dramatic breakthrough waiting on the other side of honesty. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were small changes. Consistent changes. The kind that only become visible when you look back and realize how far you have traveled. February slowly gave way to March. Snow melted from sidewalks. The trees outside began showing the first signs of spring. And for the first time in years, Claire and I started having conversations that felt real. Not because they were perfect, because they were honest. One Saturday morning, we sat together on the back patio wrapped in light jackets while the neighborhood slowly came to life around us. Birds moved through the trees. A lawn mower hummed somewhere in the distance. The air carried that familiar scent that always arrives when winter finally lets go. We sat quietly for a while before Claire spoke. I think I took a lot of things for granted. Her voice was calm. There was no attempt to defend herself. No attempt to rewrite history. Just honesty. I stared out across the yard and nodded. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I answered with a truth I had spent months learning. I think I helped make that possible. Claire looked at me. I could tell she did not expect that response. Most people want stories with villains and heroes. Clear winners and clear losers. But life is rarely that simple. The reality was that Claire had grown accustomed to receiving constant effort. At the same time, I had spent years teaching everyone around me that my needs could wait. Neither of those habits appeared overnight. Both were built one day at a time. Looking back now, I do not see those months as a period when I lost something. I see them as the period when I found something I had misplaced for a very long time. Respect for myself. Not arrogance. Not pride. Respect. The understanding that my value did not depend on how much attention I could earn from someone else. The understanding that healthy relationships require participation from both people. The understanding that love cannot survive forever when only one person is responsible for keeping it alive. Claire and I continued rebuilding from there. Some days were easier than others. Some conversations were uncomfortable. But the difference was that neither of us ignored the truth anymore. We stopped pretending effort only needed to travel in one direction. We stopped assuming tomorrow would automatically look like yesterday. And most importantly, we stopped treating each other's presence as something guaranteed. One evening, near the beginning of spring, I found myself standing in the backyard watching the sunset paint the sky shades of orange and gold. Claire stepped outside and stood beside me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she slipped her hand into mine. It was a simple gesture. Quiet. Unremarkable to anyone else. Yet it meant more than grand speeches ever could. Because this time it was her reaching across the distance. Not me carrying the entire weight alone. As I stood there watching daylight fade beyond the trees, I realized the biggest lesson from this journey had nothing to do with marriage. It had everything to do with self-worth. The moment we stop valuing ourselves, we quietly teach other people to do the same. But the moment we remember our own value, everything begins to change. Sometimes the people around us change too. Sometimes they do not. Either way, we finally stop living as though our happiness depends entirely on someone else's choices. And that, more than anything else, was the lesson I carried forward. Before this story ends, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts. If you were in my position, what would you have done after hearing those words that October evening? Do you believe Claire truly changed, or do you think she simply reacted to losing something she assumed would always be there? Stories like this often reveal something different to every person who hears them. And if you enjoy thoughtful relationship stories that explore self-respect, growth, and the complicated realities of marriage, consider subscribing so you can join us again for the next journey. Sometimes the quietest moments teach the lessons that stay with us the longest.